Someone's joining with FaceTime? Oh, that's good. Okay. Let's look at John chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. John chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. John chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. Oh my God. Okay, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with the Word. No, he was in the beginning with God. Amen. Okay, so this is book of John, written by John, right? So if you look at John chapter 20, verse 31. So John is one of the disciples of Jesus Christ, and then he wrote book of John. And John chapter 20, verse 31 tells us what's the purpose of this book. It says, John chapter 20, verse 31 says, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Okay, so the purpose of this book is, as you read this book, the purpose is so that you may come to believe in Jesus and that you may have life to the fullest. That's the purpose of this book. So after you read this book, you come to believe in Jesus, trust him, and have life to the fullest, the life of heaven. So the purpose of this book is not to become a good Christian. It's not to correct your behaviors. It's not to get some kind of lifestyle correction or become a exemplary person or get some method how to live my life. That's not the purpose of this book. The purpose of this book is so that you may believe in Jesus and you may have life, the fullness of life. So that's why this book is written, the good news gospel. So after you read this, you're like, oh, I believe in him now. And I have this life in me, is what this book is trying to accomplish, right? And it starts like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. It says, in the beginning was the Word. Right? Now, when you say in the beginning, this one appears also in Genesis. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So in Genesis chapter 1, that in the beginning means the long, long time ago. But John is not repeating that. John is not talking about long, long time ago, the creation time. This in the beginning, if you look into the original word, this in the beginning means essence, archetype, origin. So it's not talking about the time of long, long time ago, like hundred thousands of years ago. It's not time issue. This in the beginning, in original word, it's called arche, which means essence, archetype, origin. And then what does it say? In the beginning was the Word. Now, where is the word? The word is located in origin, in essence, at the core. So you will encounter word when you go to the essence, not the superficial things. When yourself arrives at the core, arrives at the essence, that's where you will contact, you will meet the word. That's where that word becomes life. When you go to the origin. Right? Same thing, like, let's say when you go to the mountain and then the water flows and then you drink the water at the bottom of the mountain, it's dirty, right? Because along the way, you don't know, it could be someone's pee, it could be contaminated, someone's washed his hair or her hair, right? So if you drink that water, stomach ache. But if you go all the way up to the mountain and go to the origin and go to where it first began and drink that water, it gives you life. It revives you. So you will contact and you will encounter the word when you arrive at the origin, at the essence, at the core. When your soul arrives there. Now, how does that happen? That happens through a turmoils and suffering in your life. When you go through the struggle, all of a sudden, all these unimportant things are let go. And then your soul, you realize your soul arrived at the origin. Your soul is encountering, came into this realm of essence. That's what the pain does to our life. The pain cuts out all these unimportant things and makes us to suddenly arrive at the origin. So that pain is God's instrument for you to go to the origin, go to the core, and there you meet the word, and there you have life and life to the fullest. So that's why John is saying, in the beginning was the word. In the beginning is the word. At the core, that's where you find the word. That's where you find life. That's where you find life and life to the fullest. Now, what is the word? You know how in verse 1 it says, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. It keeps saying word. In the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. Now, what is the word? The original word, the Greek word for word is logos. Now, what's the meaning of logos? Logos means logic. Logos, logic. Or logos means reason. So what is that word means? It means logic, reason. So you could even say in the beginning was a reason, and the reason was with God, and the reason was God. So what is this word? This word is how things are, the law of the principle and the reason of how things are. So that existed first. It's the law and reason and logic, the principle of how things are, is what word is. That makes sense, right? Because think about this. You know how things are like this, right? Like some of them are solid, some of them are gas, some of them are liquid. Why? Because behind it there's a reason. There's how things are. The logic is behind it. The principle is behind it, right? So because that principle exists, that principle and reason and logic exist, how things are or how things are, right? Does it make sense? So let's say if I push my perfume, the perfume comes out, and what does perfume do? It spreads out, right? How come the perfume doesn't gather at the corner and line up? How come they spread out? Because that's how things are, right? If I drop some object, it falls, right? The gravity, right? Because the principle already existed. The law already existed. So that principle makes solid to be solid. That principle makes liquid to be liquid. Before things are, there must be a law and the principle that governs how things are. The logos, right? Let's say if you go up, you will see more, right? If you go down, you'll be blinded. But your mind, when your mind goes high, you'll be blinded because of your arrogance. When your minds are lowered, that's when you see more. These are all laws. When you're too much filled, you become depressed. Because I need this, I need that, right? But when you're emptied, you feel the happiness. So how things are how things are because there was the reason and law and logic that already existed that makes things to be what they are in this whole universe. That's what the word is. And then what does verse 2 says? Verse 2 says, he was in the beginning with God. You know how verse 1 says, the word was with God? And then verse 2 says, he was in the beginning with God. That means who is the word? Him. Who is he? Jesus. In the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. So who is Jesus? Jesus is that logos. That logos that exists in this universe. That logic and reason and principle that existed that makes how things are to be how things are, that very reason and logic that existed came as human is Jesus. So he's the one, he was that reason and logic and principle that made the universe to be universe, that made things to be things, this to be that to be that, the logic and reason that existed, lowered himself and came as human is Jesus. That's who Jesus Christ is. So if you look at verse 3, it says this. Verse 3 says, all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. What is it saying? All things were made through Jesus, and without Jesus nothing was made that was made. So everything came about through Jesus. Everything was made through Jesus. Everything occurred through Jesus. Everything happened through Jesus. Everything is in existence through Jesus. That's who Jesus is. So he is that logos before the creation of the world, before anything existed. He is that reason and logic and principle and that mechanism that existed. And when that principle expresses itself, things become how they are. And that logos, that logic and reason and principle, when the time came, became human, is Jesus. 2,000 years ago. So that human Jesus you see, there's a way beyond story behind that. That Jesus Christ, who before the creation of the world, that logos, logic, and reason that made things to be how they are, lowered himself and contained himself, came in the body of human, is Jesus. And then what does it say? It says, and the Word was with God. What is that saying? Jesus was with God. Now, who is saying this? John, right? So this is John's confession. So Jesus Christ was, how old was he? He was around 30 for 3 years, right? How old was John when John was following Jesus? 18. So at like, are you guys 18? So like your ages, like about 18, you kind of look at this guy, he's like 30 years old. Like someone who's a little bit older than Caleb. So you guys are kind of like hanging out with Caleb, right? Okay? And John was like, oh, he's a nice person. He has a lot of love, you know. I want to hang out with him. And that was Jesus, John Jesus. And then more you hang out with this guy, you come to realize, man, this guy is with God. God's presence is always with him. God's work is always with him. That's why he's saying the Word was with God. You know, Jesus was with God. If I recall, I'm always hanging out with Jesus, and I cannot deny that God is with him. That's why he's saying the Word was with God. Why is that? Because Jesus Christ was not educated, living in very like outsider, like Galilee and Nazareth, where no education, like countryside. And he was not educated at all. But then, whenever he debated with the well-educated people, he won the debate all the time. All these Pharisees and scribes who studied the Bible their whole life, whenever they debate with Jesus, who came from the countryside, the outsider, who wasn't well educated, who was a carpenter, start talking, he always wins. And then he feeds the 5,000, he walks on the water, and then he heals the sick, and the dead person comes alive. Can you imagine that? Like, you're hanging out with Caleb, and Caleb is doing all that. It's like the same setting, right? John was 18, he was like 30. He's like, Caleb was like 27, right? So you're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Who is this guy? And then you came to your conclusion. The Word was with God, which means, oh no, this guy is with God. God is always with him. You can't deny this is God's presence. Something about God's presence is always with him. That was John's confession. The Word was with God. Right? And then you gotta think about this. Jesus Christ, if you think about it, there was the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herod and Roman government. All four of this powerful group, religious group, like political groups, and Roman government, Herod, Sadducees, and Pharisees. They all hated each other. These four groups always hated each other. They never get along. But then they got united. You know why? To kill Jesus. So Jesus made all this great group to be united. That's how threatening Jesus was to them. Like, you never get along with each other, but all of a sudden you got united to get rid of Jesus. Jesus wasn't just a nice person, like a kind person. His presence was actually I was like, can you imagine that with Caleb? Right? This powerful people united to kill Caleb, right? But then that's exactly what John was experiencing. The Word, Jesus, was with God. God was always with him. And then, what does it say? It says, his final conclusion is, the Word was God. Which means Jesus was God. So, this is John. John's like, oh shoot, that was God. Eventually, right? It's like you guys are saying to Caleb, oh, Caleb was God. So John's final conclusion is what? He was God. That Jesus that I hung out with, that older brother figure, I always with him. And his final conclusion is, Jesus was God. He was God. That was John's conclusion. Now, who is Jesus? Jesus is God. God who came. But then, how did John realize that? There are a couple of people, their confession is, Jesus, you're God. Now, when do they make the confession? They see Jesus Christ dying on the cross, and then, Jesus Christ is bleeding and just dying. So when they encounter that, they intuitively, God revealed, this is God. This must be God. This is God. That was Centurion. Centurion, the Roman soldier, he looked at the cross, he's God. And John looked at the cross, he's God. Your intuition, your instinct, come to realize and exposed to the truth that Jesus is God. Where? At the cross. Because only God does that. Let's say if someone comes and performs all the miracles and walk on the water and heal the sick, you could say, oh, that could be an angel. So all these powerful, great things that you experience, your conclusion could be, oh, that could be angel. That could be someone who God sent. But you come to realize Jesus is God at the cross. Because the one who is innocent and didn't do anything wrong, who knew no sin, in book of Corinthians it says, became sin and dying for the sinner to save the sinner who was supposed to go to hell and who was supposed to be punished, the innocent one actually bleeding and dying and being the sacrifice to rescue that sinner who's not deserving. When you encounter that, you come to realize he is God. Because the fact that he does that, he is God. He's God, that's why he does that. Someone who's not God doesn't do that. The innocent who knew no sin became the sin and actually dying for the one who don't deserve and is a sin who's supposed to be punished. You sacrifice instead. When you look into that, he is God. It's not at the powerful things that he performs that you come to realize he's God. It's this unconditional, irresistible love to even give his own life for the undeserving sinner. That act exposes he is God. That's why John is saying Jesus is God. But this thing is pretty cool if you think about it. Like, there's 30 years old man and 18 years old boy. They hang out with him. And then, oh, God is with him. Oh, he was God. And it just made his life upside down. So it's all about Jesus Christ being exposed to us, so that you may believe and have life. Right? And then John became 90 years old. He's the one who lived longest. It's kind of cool, like when Jesus was giving a message, John was right next to Jesus and leaned onto Jesus. And here, someone who was really close. So John's like leaning, and Jesus is preaching. He's like, that's cute, huh? That was the relationship between John and Jesus. And that John, if you go to book of Revelation, John, at the age of 90, he writes Revelation. And then okay, Revelation chapter 1, verse 12. Okay, I'll just read it. Look at this. This is what John says. Then I turned. This is 90 years old man now. Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with garment down to the feet, and girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. Who did he see? He saw Jesus again. Now this time, you look back, he saw it was white hair and the fiery eyes, and then like the feet of the brass, right, bronze. So he's like, he met Jesus again at the age of 90, but this time it's different looking. Why is it different? Because Revelation is the exposure of the divinity of God, Jesus. His divine nature, when he came back to John as a sign, his human clothes is no longer. His human clothes taken off, and he is exposing his godness, divine glory to John. Like, it's like, that Jesus, that Hyung that I used to hang out with, he all of a sudden, and then John at the age of 90, and he worships, right? And that exposure made him to bow down and worship, my God, my Lord. That's a pretty cool story if you think about it. If you kind of imagine it. You're like 18-year-old, you saw Jesus, hang out with him. Man, God is with him. He is God. And then later, his divine nature is exposed to you. And then you worship him. And John is proclaiming, Jesus is God, who died for my sin to save me and rescue me. Amen. That's longer than usual. But I couldn't help it because it's a pretty cool story.